The studio lights burn cold and white, suspended above like a silent interrogation. The air inside the set feels controlled, almost sterile, as if every breath has been measured before it leaves the mouth. A faint hum from the cameras fills the background, steady and patient, like they are waiting for something to break. Two men sit across from each other, separated only by a table and the invisible weight of ideology. On one side, Tucker Carlson sits still, composed, his posture relaxed in a way that feels almost defiant. On the other side, Piers leans slightly forward, eyes sharp, his expression locked into that familiar interviewer's intensity, the look of someone who believes he already knows where the truth sits, and is simply waiting for it to be confirmed. But tonight, nothing is predictable. The tension is not loud at first. It is subtle. A pause too long. A breath held half a second too late. The kind of silence that begins to feel heavier the longer it lasts. Piers speaks first, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade wrapped in politeness. Do you view Hamas as a terrorist organization? A simple question. But it lands like a trap carefully laid in advance. Tucker doesn't react immediately. He looks down for a fraction of a second, then back up, as if weighing not just the answer, but the entire framing of the question itself. Before he can fully respond, Piers continues, layering pressure onto the moment. Why is Israel killing Christians? Americans fund Israel, don't they? The atmosphere tightens. A subtle shift happens in the studio, producers off-camera freeze slightly, sensing the direction this is heading. The cameras do not move, but the energy behind them does. Tucker exhales softly, almost amused, but not quite. Piers presses again, leaning further forward now. I'm trying to work out, do you actually think Hamas are terrorists or not? The question is repeated, sharpened. It is no longer curiosity, it is pursuit. Tucker finally speaks, his voice calm but firm, as if refusing to be pulled into a frame he did not agree to enter. It includes anybody, he says. A pause. Piers blinks. Does that include Israel? The question hangs in the air immediately after it leaves his mouth. It does not fall, it suspends. For a moment, Tucker says nothing. His expression remains steady, but something behind his eyes shifts, an awareness that the conversation is no longer about definitions, but about boundaries. It includes anybody, he repeats. The repetition is deliberate. Controlled. Almost like setting a rule rather than answering a question. But Piers is not satisfied. He leans in further. Anybody? Tucker nods slightly. Anybody. A silence follows that feels heavier than the dialogue itself. It stretches across the studio like a tightening wire. Then Tucker adds, almost casually, but with a sharper edge beneath it. By the way, this focus on Iran is not actually connected to our national security. That statement changes the temperature of the room. It is no longer just a debate about definitions of terrorism. It is now about the entire structure of global threat perception. Tucker continues, his voice gaining rhythm, as if he has stepped into a well-worn argument he has made before. How many Shiite terror attacks have there been in the United States in my lifetime? Let me do the math. 0. The words land with blunt precision. Piers doesn't interrupt, but his face tightens slightly. The studio audience, if there is one, remains silent, but the silence feels different now. Less neutral. More attentive. Tucker leans back slightly in his chair, continuing. So don't tell me that the greatest threat we face is Iran. That's a lie. There is no shouting. No aggression. Only certainty. But certainty, in a room like this, becomes its own form of confrontation. Piers finally responds, trying to steer the conversation back into structure. What you are about to watch, a narrator-like voice subtly overlays the atmosphere, is a rare, unfiltered collision between two completely different worldviews. The framing is already shifting. The conversation is no longer just happening, it is being witnessed as an event. Tucker continues speaking, now addressing not just Piers, but something beyond him. "You're telling that on behalf of a foreign power," he says. The accusation is not shouted. It is delivered like a conclusion he has already reached long ago. Piers reacts immediately. That's a conspiracy theory. A familiar label. A defensive reflex. But Tucker does not flinch. "I'm not even anti-Israel on some principled level," he says. "I'm an American." The emphasis on the word American lands with weight. As if everything else in the conversation is secondary to that identity. He continues. "I don't have to take orders from you about what I'm allowed to know or not know." A subtle shift occurs again. The tone is no longer just argumentative, it is personal now. Rooted. Almost historical. "This is my country," he adds. The words hang in the air longer than expected. Piers watches him carefully now, less interrupting, more observing. As if recalibrating how to approach what he is hearing. Tucker's voice remains steady, but the intensity builds beneath it like pressure under glass. "That kind of democratic spirit informed this country my entire life, until 9/11. A pause. After which it became a thought crime to ask obvious questions. The phrase, thought crime, echoes in the space between them. Heavy. Loaded. Uncomfortable. The studio does not react, but it feels like it wants to. Piers finally tries to regain control. "Do you think Trump was vindicated?" But Tucker interrupts slightly, not aggressively, just decisively. "I can't say," he begins, then pauses. "I've been wrong so many times." For the first time, there is a moment of self-awareness in the exchange. A crack in certainty, but not collapse. He continues. "However, events have consequences we can't foresee." The conversation shifts again, like a pendulum swinging into deeper territory. Then Tucker returns to his central argument, more grounded now, almost methodical. "This focus on Iran is not connected to our national security." He repeats it again. Not as opinion, but as insistence. Piers tries again to steer. "But do you think," Tucker doesn't let him finish. He is no longer responding line by line. He is building something larger. A framework. A worldview. And the studio, unknowingly, begins to feel like it is no longer watching an interview. It is watching a collision course. As Piers prepares his next question, there is a brief pause in Tucker's expression. A stillness that suggests something deeper is about to surface. The cameras remain locked. The lights do not change. But something in the air has already shifted into a more dangerous kind of clarity. And then Piers asks the question that changes everything again. "Do you actually think Hamas are terrorists or not?" Tucker looks at him for a moment longer than before. And the answer that follows, begins to reshape the entire conversation. The silence after Piers' question feels different this time. It is not empty. It is waiting. The studio lights remain unchanged, but somehow they feel heavier now, as if they are pressing down on the conversation instead of illuminating it. The hum of the cameras becomes more noticeable, like a machine that has started paying closer attention. Piers holds his gaze steady. "Do you actually think Hamas are terrorists or not?" The question is no longer casual. It is sharpened, compressed, almost final, like it is designed to force a single word answer that can be used as a conclusion. Tucker doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilts his head slightly, not in confusion, but in resistance. The kind of silence that is not absence of thought, but refusal to accept the frame being offered. When he finally speaks, his voice is calm, measured. "I think any organization that kills innocent people is committing terrorism." A pause. The answer sounds clean on the surface. But it does not settle the room. It expands it. Piers senses the shift immediately. "So that includes Hamas?" he pushes again. Tucker nods once. "It includes anybody." The phrase returns again. Like a loop that refuses to close. Piers leans forward, sharpening his tone. Does that include Israel? The question hits harder this time. Not because it is new, but because it is now being used as a mirror. Tucker doesn't react quickly. A faint pause stretches between them, just long enough for the audience, real or imagined, to feel the weight of what is being asked. It includes anybody, Tucker repeats again. But this time, something changes in how he says it. Less explanation. More boundary. The studio feels like it tightens again. Not louder, but more concentrated. Piers exhales slightly, frustrated now, abandoning subtlety. You can't just say anybody and avoid the question, he says. Tucker's eyes narrow slightly, not in anger, but in focus. I'm not avoiding it, he replies. I'm refusing your categories. That line lands differently. For a brief moment, there is no rebuttal. Only processing. The conversation shifts again, like a camera adjusting its lens. Piers tries a different angle, stepping away from definitions. You said Iran isn't a threat to U.S. national security. Tucker nods. Yes. And you really believe that? Piers asks. Tucker leans back slightly in his chair. I don't believe it. I observe it. The distinction is subtle, but deliberate. The studio feels quieter now. Even the air seems stiller. Tucker continues, voice steady but increasingly layered with conviction. How many attacks in this country have been carried out by Shiite groups? In my lifetime? He pauses. 0. Piers doesn't interrupt, but his expression tightens again. Tucker continues. So when you tell me that's the central threat? I'm asking, where is the evidence? The word evidence hangs in the air like a challenge no one has stepped forward to take. A producer off-camera shifts slightly. A chair creaks faintly. Small sounds suddenly feel amplified. Piers tries to regain control of the narrative. This is about global stability, but Tucker cuts in, not loudly, but firmly. No, he says. A pause. This is about what we choose to prioritize. The word choose lingers. Piers studies him now more carefully, as if trying to locate where the argument is anchored. Then he shifts tone again, introducing a new thread. What about your claims that Western governments are influenced by foreign interests? A subtle shift in the room again. The topic has expanded beyond conflict zones into systems of power. Tucker doesn't deny the premise outright. Instead, he reframes. I said I think foreign policy should be based on the interests of the people living in the country making it. Piers interrupts. That sounds like isolationism. Tucker shakes his head. No. That sounds like democracy. A beat. The word democracy feels heavier in his mouth than it should. The tension rises, not through volume, but through contradiction. Two people using the same words to mean entirely different worlds. Piers leans back slightly now, changing strategy. You've been called anti-Semitic for some of your comments. A familiar escalation. A familiar boundary being tested. Tucker exhales through his nose, almost like he expected this turn. I've been called a lot of things, he replies. That doesn't make them true. The response is calm, but there is an edge underneath it now. Not anger, but exhaustion with the label itself. The studio shifts again. The conversation is no longer about one organization, or one country. It is now about permission. Who is allowed to question what? Who is allowed to define what is true? Piers senses that the conversation is slipping away from his structure, so he makes one final push. Do you think Hamas is a terrorist organization or not? The question is repeated again, but this time it feels different. Because the answer is no longer just about Hamas. It is about everything that has been said before it. Tucker looks at him for a long moment. Then he speaks. I think killing civilians is terrorism. A pause. And I think anybody who does it is responsible for it. The sentence lands cleanly, but it does not end the argument. Because now Piers does something unexpected. He stops pushing definitions. And instead asks something else entirely. Then does that include states? The room changes again. The question is no longer about labels. It is about symmetry. Tucker doesn't answer immediately. For the first time, the silence feels uncertain, not controlled. The cameras stay fixed. The lights remain unchanged. But the direction of the conversation is no longer predictable. And just as Tucker begins to respond, the moment stretches, just enough, to feel like something irreversible is about to be said. The silence this time is not waiting. It is tension held at breaking point. Tucker finally speaks, but his voice is lower now, slower, as if every word must pass through a filter before being allowed into the room. It includes anybody. The phrase returns again, but now it carries the weight of everything that came before it. It no longer sounds like repetition. It sounds like conclusion. Piers doesn't respond immediately. For the first time, he seems to be choosing his words carefully instead of firing them. The studio feels suspended, like a moment stretched too thin. Then Tucker adds, almost quietly, but with unmistakable finality. If you kill innocent people, you are responsible for that. A pause. That doesn't change based on who you are. The simplicity of the statement contrasts sharply with everything around it. No ideology. No framing. Just structure. Piers shifts in his seat slightly. And Israel, he asks again, softer this time, but no less direct. Tucker doesn't hesitate now. It applies to anyone. The words land, but this time, there is no follow-up. No expansion. No retreat. Just stillness. A stillness that feels heavier than argument. The studio lights continue to hum. The cameras continue recording. But something about the energy has changed shape entirely. It is no longer a debate. It is a standoff between two ways of interpreting moral responsibility itself. Piers finally exhales, leaning back. So where does that leave us, he asks. It is not a challenge now. It sounds almost like a question directed at the room itself. Tucker looks at him for a moment longer than usual. The intensity has not increased, but it has settled. I think it leaves us with one standard, he says. A pause. And that is all there should ever be. The phrase hangs in the air without clarification. Piers doesn't interrupt. For once, there is nothing immediate to push against. The conversation slows, not because it is ending, but because it has reached a point where further escalation no longer changes its shape. A producer somewhere off-camera signals subtly, but no one moves yet. The moment is still being allowed to exist. Tucker leans slightly forward now, not aggressive, but anchored. You can argue about politics, he says. You can argue about nations, history, alliances. Another pause. But you can't change what killing innocent people is. Silence. This time, Piers does not counter. Not because he agrees. But because the conversation has moved past the kind of exchange where countering is enough. The studio feels almost frozen now. The cameras continue rolling, but the energy has shifted from confrontation to aftermath, even while still in motion. And then, slowly, Piers nods once. Not in agreement. But in acknowledgement that the conversation has reached its limit. The lights still burn overhead. The microphones still capture every breath. But neither man speaks for a moment that feels longer than the entire interview combined. Then the narrator's tone subtly returns, as if closing a frame that has been held open too long. What you have just witnessed, it says, is not just an argument between two individuals. A pause. It is a collision of two irreconcilable ways of defining truth, responsibility, and power. The camera lingers on both men. Tucker sits back, composed. Piers sits forward slightly, still processing. Neither victorious. Neither defeated. Just exposed. The screen begins to feel like it is pulling away from them. Not because the conversation is resolved, but because it cannot continue in the same way anymore. And as the final seconds drain from the moment, the narrator's voice lowers one last time. In an age where labels define reality, what happens when someone refuses all of them? The screen holds. Then fades.